Ports, and more ports are what make this Mac Mini, along with the M2 Pro chip, a killer value for performance. Bang for buck, without a doubt. Now, until they make an M2 Ultra and put it inside of a Mac Studio, this is the topic of discussion, or should be, in the tech space. There are other content creators out there who are forming their opinions of the M2 chip and the M2 Pro and the M2 Max as a perspective of someone who had the M1 Pro and the M1 Max. You're not supposed to see a huge revolutionary jump in performance. You're supposed to see a marginal increase. Duh. And not everyone who's looking at your review is coming from a M1 Pro, M1 Max like you guys are. We are all privileged tech creators who get to use the latest and greatest year after year, but we also have to keep in mind and in sight that there are people who have never used these chips and are looking at these M2 chips. So with that being said, I'm gonna give you the proper insight as to how to pick your M2 Pro Mac Mini. Now, there are a lot of numbers and tests that have been done, so we have all type of conclusions and information. Notice this, when you look at the M2 chip and the M2 Pro chip, the biggest deciding factor or separation in between these two, not only is it core count, but it's mainly GPU. GPU is the biggest deciding factor amongst the M2 Pro, and the M2 Max. So, as I'm going to tell you guys again, when you get ready to set up your device for purchase, or if you've already purchased one, just think about this. Pick your chipset correctly first. That's number one. How many GPU cores do you need? You get a 16-core GPU. Now, if you want more, the option that Apple gives you is to spend $300 to get a 19-core GPU, which puts you at $1,599. Now, if you're looking at this 19-core GPU, you're probably looking to do more with your machine, which means you're probably going to increase the RAM and storage. I'm at $2,199. Here's something I want you to think about. You can look at a Mac Studio in its base format, which starts at $1,999. You can get the 24 cores of GPU, which is going to perform from a graphical standpoint better than the M2 Pro. It's just a fact. So if you go for better GPU performance, then you go with the M1 Max. You already get 32 gigs of memory. And even if you upgrade to the 1 terabyte of storage, which is a $200 upgrade, that puts you at exactly $2,199. I'm telling you this from a perspective of value per performance. Okay, so let's get back to the M2 Pro. Now, when you look at the M2 Pro, this is just the base setup. As I told you, you're gonna pick your chip. And if you're trying to go for that 19-core chip, you already know which road you should be walking down after what I just told you. RAM is the next thing you wanna pick. RAM is important, and it's something you can't change, and it's something that you will regret if you don't give yourself enough. And then storage, I always like to give more. So even here at a 32 RAM setup with a 1 terabyte storage, I'm knocking on that M1 Max Studio setup. Now, if you don't want the Mac Studio, you stick to the M2 Pro and you configure it. Now let's talk about the M2 Pro chip and how it's stacking up alongside the M2 Pro inside of the laptops, as well as the M1 Max and so forth, because you're gonna notice a recurring pattern when we look at these devices. So let's pull up some Geekbench numbers and stuff really quick. Single core, if you look at all of the M2 Pro single cores, whether it's the 14-inch, the 16-inch, they're all in line with each other. I'm gonna show you guys an example of even up to the M2 Max as well and so forth, or the M1 Max. So the M1 Pro is where you can see the difference in between the new gen versus the old gen. And if you look at the M2 Air single core, which is the M2 chip with no thermals, of course it's gonna be in line with the other ones. But when we go into multi-core performance, as you guys can see, it's still in line no matter if you do a 14-inch MacBook Pro or a 16-inch MacBook Pro. And the same is gonna be said when I show you guys M2 Max and so forth. But as you can see, the M2 Air with not so good thermal, which you do get better thermal if you get a Mac Mini, is not doing so well in the multi-core performance. But the M1 Pro, as you guys can see, is getting left behind by 400 points or so. Now, here is what I wanna show you guys when it comes to the M2 Max, M2 Pro, Mac Mini, and the M1 Max. Look at the scores. When you look at the M2 Pro's single core and multi-core in comparison to the M2 Max, it's neck and neck. A very small margin of difference when it comes to CPU. This is all CPU. This is why I'm telling you the deciding factor as to what chip you should choose is GPU, especially when it comes to this new Apple Silicon architecture, because I mean, at the end of the day, they're all powerful, all of them. Okay, so here's a scenario where you get to see the M1 Max's GPU cores really crank against the M2 Pro Mac Mini. So in this example from Created by Ella, you guys are seeing clear that the M2 Pro Mac Mini came in at 5 minutes and 55 seconds, but the M1 Max with 24 cores of GPU goodness came in at 3 minutes and 15 seconds. That is the deciding factor. All right, so the biggest thing I want you to take away from this is figure out and determine how many GPU cores you actually need when you're stepping into this pro arena. Now, this device right here is bang for buck. It's starting in at $1299. You're getting 4 Thunderbolt 4 ports on the rear with 2 USB-A's, you know, headphone jack, a gigabit Ethernet, and if you want 10 gigabit, you can upgrade to that for like $100. I don't think I will, but there's enough options for you to future-proof this to a degree. But again, headroom is something to think about when building these Apple Silicon devices because they're all soldered on. No changes made after you choose what you choose. Me personally, if I'm looking for more GPU beyond the M2 Pro, right now the best bang for buck in my opinion is still the M1 Max inside the Mac Studio. You're getting more ports, you're getting an SD card reader, you're getting more bang for your buck in that arena if you're trying to build this out beyond what it is. If you're trying to stick to just the base and the base is enough for you and you want to add maybe a little bit more RAM and a little bit more storage, even then, the M1 Mac Studio is still a better hookup. But that's the ladder and that's how Apple builds it. They give you just enough, close enough to the next one so that you dance in between the two and then you honestly probably leave spending more than what you came to spend. But if you can dial in on the M2 Pro, where it is in the Mac Mini at the lower kind of tier build and get along with that, you're getting the value. But the second you start upgrading this thing and start leaning into that Mac Studio territory, I don't know, at that point, I just think the Mac Studio is a better buy. You either wait for the M2 Max or you get the M1 Max now. At the end of the day, from M2 Max to M1 Max, I can show you guys numbers, which I probably will put some up on the screen. It's not that big of a difference. Another thing, please listen. The M2 Max has a higher power draw. You guys are gonna see all of these videos, I'm pretty sure coming, about the thermals, oh, the overheating and so forth. If you take a chip that is better cooled in a Mac Studio housing because that has the proper thermals and you put it in something smaller like the Mac Mini or a laptop which is even thinner, how could you expect that chip not to have heating issues and not to throttle? Throttling is good. It's saving your chip from destroying itself and overheating into oblivion. If you use extensive tasks that pull and draw extensive heat and power over time, an extended period of time, that chip is gonna throttle. I don't care what laptop you have. So please don't fall for the thermals and overheating clickbait and cap out here. Every laptop's throttling.